Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants, depending on where you are around the world. I am Britt, Ajvazi, Product Marketing Manager for GRC at PECB International. Thank you for taking some time off your busy schedules to participate in this webinar on ISO 21500, Generating Business Value Through Strong Project Management, brought to you by PECB. Today's presenter is Mr. Bryan Strawser, Principal Consultant and CEO at BrightPath LLC. Bryan leads a global distributed network of executives and subject matter experts that help public, private, and nonprofit clients develop stronger organizational preparedness and resilience to disruptions around the world. His areas of expertise include project program management, global continuity and resiliency, crisis and emergency management, enterprise risk management, crisis communications, global security, and public-private partnerships. Bryan also holds multiple professional certifications, including the PMP, PGMP, and PFMP certifications from the Project Management Institute. He is one of PECB's most successful instructors for project management, information security, and business continuity. During this webinar session, please write any questions or comments you may have in the chat box in the control panel on your screen, and Mr. Strawser will be glad to respond to them through email. Without further ado, I give you Mr. Bryan Strawser. Bryan, you may begin.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone attending, and thanks for joining us today. As Britt said, we'll talk about the ISO 21500 standard today, which is the standard or guidance on project management. Just for background, let's start with a little bit of history on the ISO 21500 standard. The development for this standard really began in 2006, primarily driven in the UK, with an eye on the project and program management required to execute the 2012 Olympic Games there in London. Most of the major project management associations globally were involved in the development of this standard. So that includes PMI, the Project Management Institute, the International Project Management Association, and the UK Cabinet Office, which is the kind of guiding authority for the Prince 2 standard and certification processes. So that was really the birthplace of this standard. It was first issued in 2012, and here you see kind of the normal structure to an ISO standard. For the project management standard, we have it begins with a simple scope statement. It breaks into the terms and definitions, and then it defines the concepts for project management, really ensuring that there's a common language used for project management. Then it describes the project management processes, and then it goes into, in the annexes, the appendixes, the kind of process and subject groups. And this is essentially the process that, or the direction that we're going to follow as we walk through this webinar today. So let's start with the very basics. The beginning of the ISO standard, the ISO 21500 standard, begins with the first clause about scope. And it really just defines that the standard is about the guidance for project management. But when we get into the second clause, we start to get into some very specific project management terms. And what we're doing here in the standard is we're outlining a common language for project management and defining that. And in some ways, as you'll see in a few minutes, when I compare this to other standards, we're bringing things together using some common definitions and in some ways connecting them to the other standards as well. So the second clause of the standard is really just a breakdown of terms and definitions, and it defines 16 project management terms. And for those of you that manage projects, this is going to be very familiar to you. For example, it defines a change request. And the change request is defined as the documentation that defines the proposed alteration to the project. And it goes, so this part of the standard walks through 16 different terms to really outline what those definitions are and lay the groundwork for the rest of the standard. From here, the standard begins to break out the project management concepts and execution. So let's take a look at this graphic here, this figure that really defines how a project connects strategically within an organization. So if we're looking at this from the top down, projects should always begin with a connection to the organization's strategy. So what are what is the organization's strategic objective? And from that kind of strategic view, well, what are the opportunities to influence those objectives? So how can we achieve those objectives? What are the opportunities we see here? And then we get into the project. Projects should have a business case that ties back to that organizational strategy and the opportunity that we're attempting to address with this project. And then once we get through that, we start to look at the project organization. How are we set up? That will be governance and the project team, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And then the project itself, what are the processes that we follow for the project in terms of project management? What are the product and support processes? But ultimately, out of this project, when it's completed or as it is completed, as we work through implementation, we're going to have a set of deliverables. And those deliverables will ultimately transition from the temporary project organization over to operations. So who will own this project in the long run, this product that we've created or this deliverable that we're delivering? And ultimately, those deliverables should have benefits. And those benefits can be qualitative. It could be a reputational gain or a brand gain for a company, or they can be quantitative. Perhaps it's a financial gain, maybe it's a productivity gain, maybe it's a quality gain. But those benefits should go back to that original business case and drive some type of benefit to the organization's strategy and strategic objectives. So what we're trying to say here in the standard is that any project should be connected to your organization's strategy, should have a solid business case, a governance process, should be managed through the project management lifecycle, should have deliverables that are ultimately transitioned to operations, its end owner, and that there will be benefits that go back to the original strategy and strategic objectives. So with that background, what does the ISO standard say is a project? Well, a project is a unique set of processes that consists of coordinated and controlled activities with a start and end date and is performed to achieve project objectives. So again, it's something that's unique, consisting of activities that are coordinated and controlled, has a start and end, and is performed to achieve a set of objectives. And achieving those objectives will require the delivery or provision of deliverables that conform to a set of requirements. So we're talking here about some type of temporary effort that has a start and end that involves some unique processes and is tied back to the objectives of the project in the business case. So when we look at actually managing the project, the ISO standard says that there are 3 key components to managing this effort. First, that project management is really about how we apply methods and tools and techniques and competencies to a project. It includes the integration of the project management lifecycle, which we'll cover in a moment, and it's controlled through a set of processes. It's monitored and controlled through a set of processes. These 3 components together are how the ISO standard defines project management. So let's look at these connection points here in the project management lifecycle. And we'll start with what I think often gets missed, and that is, how does a project advance the strategies for an organization? So here is a figure from the ISO standard that explains the value creation framework, or essentially, how does the project tie to the strategy and contribute benefits back to the organization? So here from left to right, what we see is the identification of strategy. So this is going to be the strategic objectives of the organization, from which there are opportunities identified. And then projects are created in order to address those opportunities. Those projects, as they are delivered in transition to operations, will contribute benefits that go back to driving that strategy. But let's talk about this in a way that is an example, because I like to make things as real as possible as we talk about how this really works. One of my clients is a retailer, and one of the objectives, one of the strategies of this retailer to improve profitability is to reduce loss. So they want to have less product stolen by individual, dishonest employees, but also from dishonest shoppers or shoplifters. And they want, but more importantly, they want to address operational processes that create a loss, where they have accuracy or quality issues within their technology or within their store and distribution processes. So one of their strategic objectives is to reduce loss. From there, they identified a set of opportunities that they could address, and one of them was essentially system improvements within their inventory system. They're going to try to improve the accuracy of their inventory at a financial level within their general ledger system. So they had a technology project that went directly towards that opportunity. The project was a 13-month effort, so it had a defined beginning and end. It had a set of objectives, all of which were tied back to this business case. And in the end, after implementation, they were able to reduce their loss. They improved their inventory accuracy, which reduced the kind of their paperwork or process loss by about 5%. Their benefits were both qualitative in that they could look at some non-financial benefits, but they also had the quantitative benefit of saying, well, it's a 5% reduction in loss. That translated to about $18 million in improved gross margin. So they had a very tangible financial benefit to what they did. It was a very successful project in terms of creating value for the company and tying back to their strategic objectives. So here, let's talk about how kind of the overall project environment, and within a company's or an organization's portfolio of projects and programs that are going on, there's a lot of different ways that projects can interrelate to a bigger program or to an overall portfolio. So here we see some different examples of that. If I go from left to right, typically, particularly in larger organizations, you may group sets of projects that share common objectives and common governance and perhaps even common goals within a program. So here we see in the upper left an example of a program where there are multiple projects going on, and then we also have a box for other activities which are often going to be more ongoing operational components. Here, the interaction between the project and the program would be that they would share some common objectives and some common governance, but the program would actually typically act as the governing body for a project and would start and stop projects, initiate and close projects that connected to that program in order to drive the program's strategic objectives. In the middle, we see an example of just a portfolio of projects without any programs in place. And on the right, we see kind of a mix of the two approaches, where we have a large project portfolio where there is a set of projects that are part of the portfolio, and then we also see a set of programs which are made up of multiple projects that are also part of the portfolio. This structure of project and program and portfolio really varies based upon the size of your organization or of your client. It might vary based on how the company is set up organizationally, but these are all different ways in which project programs and portfolios can interact. In very large companies where I was a project and program and later portfolio manager, it was fairly typical to see a large portfolio managed at the very senior level of the organization, where, for example, I led all portfolio efforts within about a fifth of the company I worked for, and we had multiple projects and programs within that portfolio, and as the portfolio manager, I was responsible Sorry about that. I've lost my phone connection here. So as I was saying, these are common ways in which projects and portfolios and programs can interact in an organization. From here, let's talk a little bit about the governance of a project effort. I strongly believe that good governance is a key success factor to a project. And governance does not have to be an overly cumbersome setup within a company or project. What we're aiming for here, at least according to the way the standard presents governance, is that we want to define the management structure of the project and the organization. We want to outline our processes and policies and methodologies to be used for governance. In other words, how are we going to escalate problems? How are we going to make decisions? How will we control the scope of a project? And how do we talk about and manage and mitigate the risks? It should include the limits of authority for decision-making. What decision-making rights does the project manager have, and what decision-making rights will be reserved to the project steering committee or board or the project sponsor, depending upon how your organization manages projects. We want to define the responsibilities and accountabilities for the stakeholders for the project. And we want to talk about what the interactions are for reporting and the escalation of issues and risks. It's often easier to look at this one in more of a graphic way. So let's take a look at what this shows us. In the bottom part of the circle here, we have the project organization. So this is essentially the project team, the individuals that are working on this project. We have the project management team, which is really going to be the leadership group that is involved in managing the project. And that leadership group might just be the project manager on some efforts, but it might involve a project manager who then has individuals assigned for metrics and communication and project tracking or resource assignment, just depending upon what type of effort we're talking about. We have the project manager, of course, who owns the execution of the project and is responsible for that project. Interaction between the project manager and the project sponsor, the sponsor being the executive or manager, senior manager that owns the project in question, or maybe is the ultimate user of this software that's being developed, for example, in a technology project. And then above that, we have the steering committee or board. So this might just be, a small group of individuals of which the project sponsor is one, or perhaps it's a steering committee made up of key stakeholders that are senior executives within an organization. We surround all of this with kind of the other stakeholders or drivers to a project. And on the left, you see regulatory bodies and perhaps the project or program management office at a company that defines standards that you have to follow. It could be your customers or other interest groups. And on the right, you have more of the internal components, the employees and your shareholders, your investors or financial providers and your business partners. From here, the standard goes into kind of breaking out the process groups and subject groups for project management. The ISO standard in the process groups, which we would think of as the project management lifecycle, really defines 5 process groups. And these are initiating, or how do you start, gain approval, for example, for a project. And then you get into the life cycle of planning, implementing, controlling, and closing. And this is essentially, as we'll see in a following slide, it's essentially a kind of a life cycle, a loop of activities within a project as you move from phase to phase and begin to provision your deliverables out to your operations function, of how we plan to execute the project, how do we then implement the project through activities, how do we control those activities while they're going on, controlling for scope and for risk and for financial control, and then how do we close them, deliver them, transition them to operations, and then move on to the next phase or close the overall project. It would be interesting here to take a brief look at and compare kind of how the ISO standard breaks out the process groups and how the Project Management Institute's book, the Project Management Book of Knowledge, or PMBOK, calls the same thing, and you can see the similarities between the two standards. ISO and PMBOK use the same terms for initiating and planning, where the ISO standard calls the next phase implementing. PMI would call that as executing. ISO will call it controlling. PMI will call it monitoring and controlling. And the last phase for both is closing. So the differences here are pretty minor, but it's good to know these to understand kind of the common language being used in project management. Here's how these process groups interact across the phases of a project. On the left, we see kind of the start, the initiating process group, which interacts with planning. And as you move from perhaps phase to phase, you may see some more interaction between these two process groups. And then we move into a loop. And the loop is we go from planning to implementing to controlling, over to planning. And then as we move through phases, or we move through to the end of a project, then we use the closing process group to close out those phases, or the end of the project itself. The process groups then get into a significant level of detail around really a set of inputs and outputs. And this graphic has a lot on it in terms of showing the interactions between the process groups and their representative inputs and outputs. So let's just highlight what this really means. With initiating, we see with a new project that our inputs here are going to be the business case. So what is the business case? How are we connecting this project back to strategy? We'll see perhaps there's a contract that is a part of this effort, and then there often will be a statement of work as an input outlining the specific work to be done. Your organization may have some different standards. You may have a project management office that requires other artifacts. So these are the illustrative ones used in the ISO standard as an example. If we go over to the far right on the closing process group, we see an output. And the output here is the project or phase closure report at the end of the project or at the end of the phase. So again, what this is showing is the kind of representative breakdown of inputs and outputs across the different process groups. From here, the standard moves into kind of a breakdown of 10 different project management themes within the subject groups, as we see listed here: integration, stakeholder, scope, resource, etc. And it outlines 39 processes that are connected back to these 10 themes. Won't go through these in any great level of detail. They're available in the standard, far beyond the scope of what we have time to go through today. But just so you understand the breakdown that's here in terms of the subject groups and how they break out into additional processes. Now let's talk through just some other, a couple specific areas that come up in project management. The first is just managing risk. Every project is going to have some level of risk involved. And to ensure the project is completed successfully, we want to manage that risk. We think of the risk within the context of the standard as a subject group, and we want to manage that effectively across the project. So the standard refers to 5 processes here. That first, we want to identify the risks involved in the project. We want to analyze those risks both from a qualitative and quantitative perspective. So here we're thinking about, well, what is the risk and what is the potential impact? What's the likelihood of it happening? And then how am I going to mitigate or remove or transfer that risk? And that's going to be my developing risk responses. And then throughout the project, I'm going to control those risks through my control processes. So this is, again, where I should be having transparent, candid conversations in my governance process around this. The other issue that comes up in every project is that none of them ever run as smoothly as we think they're going to. That we will come across obstacles that we need to address throughout the project. So what we want to do here is use our governance process to have a way to escalate issues and remove obstacles. So here we're looking for, my advice is to ensure that there is transparent communication, particularly between the project manager, the project sponsor, and the steering committee, and other stakeholders that have a stake, major stakeholders that have a stake in that project. That your governance meetings are not just an update on the project, but that there is good discussion around risks and how we are mitigating those risks, that good discussion around timelines and where we have risk for slipping, unexpected complexities that come up, and then just discussion of obstacles. And that in your processes that we have good, clear escalation processes for problems. So how do we escalate an issue to the project sponsor and then on to the steering committee where needed to be able to address those challenges that are out there. So let's talk about this in context of an actual case study where things didn't go very well. One of my clients this year is a large privately held company here in the United States, and one of their efforts that they launched 2 years ago was a business intelligence project that was to last about 2 years and was going to cost about $11.5 million in US dollars. And when they brought in a new program manager, they noticed that he immediately noticed that the project, which was about 18 months in process at the point where he was brought in, appeared to be running out of budget while there was a significant amount of work that remained uncompleted. So his initial steps after getting his feet under him was to complete a project roadmap and financial analysis. So what they were looking at here is what was the original scope of the project? What is the understood scope of the project today? How much has been completed? What remains? And how does all of this connect back to their budget? What's their resource spend? And how much spend is going to be required to complete the remaining work? That analysis confirmed that the effort was nearly out of money, and there was probably about 18 months of work left. So a 2-year project became a 3-year project with about a 25 to 30% increase in cost. So the project sponsor, the IT leadership team, and the steering committee were caught quite off guard by this result. And I should also point out when this program manager came in that began asking for some basic project management artifacts. Can I see the project charter? Can you show me a risk register? Can you show me a risk analysis that was completed? And none of these documents really existed that were out there. So what were the issues here? I mean, what was really at the core of this that caused these issues to happen? Well, the first is that there was a pretty significant failure in the governance process. The steering committee, although made up of nearly half of the executive team, the senior leaders of this organization, the steering committee was really just an update process. The project team came in and gave an update and did not invite debate or necessarily put controversial topics in front of the group. And so even a discussion of scope and progress and the budget, throughout the effort weren't covered. So there was a big breakdown in having good, transparent governance processes. And there was also just a lack of financial reporting to project sponsors and the IT and business leadership team that was involved in this effort. There was an obvious project management failure in that these issues weren't communicated for several months, but also that just the core artifacts, the basic artifacts to manage a project particularly of this scale didn't exist. And there was actually not a change control process or a scope control process. So there were significant changes to scope that occurred without any formal analysis or review. For example, this project ran into pretty significant unexpected complexity in the work that they were doing in order to meet the deliverable expectations of the client, but didn't have any controls on the fact that this complexity would significantly drive up costs and extend the timeline for the project. Never really communicated that in a way that could be understood by the team. Let's wrap up by just looking at some connection points between the ISO standard and other efforts that are out there. There are, of course, other project management standards. The Project Management Institute has 3 standards that are applicable to project management if you want to learn more. The Project Management Book of Knowledge is really about projects, and then there are standards for both program and portfolio management that PMI publishes. There's the Prince 2 standard from the UK Cabinet Office. There is also the Agile or Scrum methodology, less of a standard, more of a methodology in how to manage mostly software development projects. There's also the Competence Baseline, or ICB, which is from the International Project Management Association. There are also lots of different certifications in project management. The Project Management Institute, or PMI, offers several different project management certifications, including the very commonly known Project Management Professional, or PMP, but they also have standards for, or certifications for program, portfolio, and several specialty project management certifications. For example, they have one for Agile project managers. Prince 2 has certifications for the foundation, practitioner, and professional. And there are also certifications, again, from IPMA, from the Association for Project Management, and the Australian Institute of Project Management. And then, of course, there are certifications available in the ISO standard itself from organizations like PECB as an implementer, lead implementer, auditor, and lead auditor. So that concludes the core part of the presentation. I think we have a few minutes left to take a look at questions before we wrap up, and I see 2.
Yes, I forwarded you 2 messages from the chat box. If you could answer them, please, Brian.
Sure. So on slide 15, there was a question about the ISO standard versus the Prince 2 phases, and I didn't break these out here. So let me, I'll have to answer that one via email since I don't have the Prince 2 standard in front of me at the moment. So we'll get back to that one. The second question is, okay, who should establish the transparent atmosphere in cases where there's a problem in communication? Should it be the project sponsor to ask during each step of the project, or should the project manager decide on properly informing and keeping the issues transparent? My answer here is that it really should be both. When the project is launching, I think it's important in the initial planning phases that the project sponsor and the project manager really determine and talk through how they're going to communicate when there are issues. And that in the steering committee processes, that whoever is going to drive the steering committee, which is often the project sponsor, will do that. That there are some basic standards put into place, basic expectations perhaps is the right term, put into place around what type of topics are going to be discussed and what level of transparency that we're really looking for. I have really only seen large, complex projects be successful when there is a complete open level of communication between the project sponsor and the project manager. In the example that I highlighted earlier with the business intelligence project that had some significant governance challenges, one of the biggest issues in that situation is that the project sponsor it was obvious to them that there was an issue, that they were running late on the timeline, and they hadn't delivered the scope of work that they expected. They began asking actually several months before the new program manager had come in to ask about, well, where are we against budget and scope, and we weren't getting an answer. So there was a lack of transparency there, where those are questions that a project manager should be able to answer pretty easily. Where does the project stand in terms of scope and budget today? And so I would say, that really is something that has to be discussed early on between the project manager and the project sponsor. Okay, I see a third question. How popular is the ISO certification with companies or public organizations? I have seen it become much more commonly accepted in the past year or two than I had in the past. I think the PMBOK and the PMI processes are probably the most commonly understood, but as the ISO standard, was first published in 2012, and the more communication and training that I've seen go on around that, I've seen it increase pretty significantly in popularity, particularly with larger organizations where some of the structures and processes that are understood or communicated in the standard are maybe perhaps easier to digest. I think that's the end of the questions. Oh, one more.
A final one for today.
Okay. Can I explain the differences between project management and the automotive industry's advanced product quality planning? No, I can't. I'll have to answer that one via email. That's going to require a little bit of research on my end. That's a good question. Okay, well, thanks everyone for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions via email.
Thank you, Mr. Strawser, for your effective presentation, and the audience for your attention and participation throughout the webinar. So, as Mr. Strawser said, we will be extracting all your questions and comments you have, and we will respond to them accordingly through your emails. So for those interested, PECB offers training, exam, and certification services for ISO 21500 project management guidelines. So please visit our website, www.pecb.org, for more information. In addition, we would appreciate if you would also spare 2 minutes to take a short survey that will be provided to you as soon as the session ends for any feedback you may have regarding the webinar. Please check our website and other communication channels for news updates on coming webinars. And moreover, every Wednesday, same time, there will be webinars on the field of governance, risk, and compliance for those who are interested in listening to them. Thank you again, and I look forward to your participation in upcoming webinar sessions.